We need more people who are going to stand up with a spine and say, listen, I don't care about your money. I don't care what you think I should think about your money. I don't care if you think I need the money. That's not why I'm running. And listen, you would be amazed at how many people look at me dead in the eye, people like me, and they say, you're not going to win.
Yes,
There's
you
no
are.
way you're going to win.
Yes, you
Because,
are.
because you don't have notoriety, you have no name recognition, you don't have a war chest. And I said, hey, listen, that is not my problem, sir or ma'am. That is actually your problem because you're not doing anything about it. And I don't want to be an and I don't want to make you sound like you're not doing your job. But at the end of the day, if you're going to come to a guy like me who's trying to give you what you're asking for and you're rejecting it, then you either A, want to change the system, or B, you just want to complain. Which one
Yep.
is it?
We have Mike Faris here. He's running for U.S. Senate to represent Kentucky. He's a former U.S. Air Force veteran, business owner of Prime Hawks Aviation Maintenance based out of Elizabethtown, Kentucky. Hi, Mike. Welcome to the Jill and Stacy Show. We're excited to have you.
Good morning, Jill and Stacy. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I was born in actually Corden, Indiana, in 1986, about 5 days before Christmas. At 2.5 months old, my biological mother kind of dumped me off with a boyfriend she was with. And then several weeks later, I would end up in foster care in Hardin County, Kentucky. We were in Meade County at the time, but ended up in the CPS system of Hardin County, Kentucky, and was given to a great family out of Sonora called Alan and Laverne Fry. They kind of raised foster children, had three of their own biological children. I was with that family until I was about 3.5 years old when the failed CPS system gave me back to the biological mother for whatever reason. And then, so from that 3.5 year age until 12 years, I kept in touch with that foster family, even though I was living with the biological mother. Kind of went through a lot of, bad things with abuse and just kind of really bad lives in southern Indiana and, the northern Kentucky ghettos of Louisville. And then so finally had gotten into enough trouble, I think, as an adolescent that I'd raised enough noise and was destined either for a boys' home or, had to do something else. So I kind of made the suggestion and said, hey, well, how about we make something work with the former foster parent, and let that family adopt me. And so the biological mother agreed, and we did what they called a parental guardianship over a full-scale adoption. But anyway, 12 years old, they kind of took me in as their own. And from that point, kind of, jumped right on a tractor with dad out in Sonora, raising tobacco and hay until I was 18 and graduated from Central Hardin there in Cecilia, Kentucky, and then joined the Air Force as a helicopter repairman. So did that for about 3 years. Decided it wasn't really for me. Had some trouble with that as well, as far as the government not paying me the money that they were contractually obligated to pay me. So I had to fight that with congressional letters, and when you do that and you kind of go up against the establishment there, you get a target on your back as well. So I decided, all right, well, it's time for me to get out of this mess. Kind of got back out in the civilian world and then joined, the rotary wing helicopter community as a civilian contractor. Spent several years in Iraq, and of course Afghanistan as well, and then across all the bases in Kentucky, be it Fort Campbell, Fort Knox, and Lexington's BGAD. So anyway, in about 2013, I'd kind of realized, I was working at Fort Knox at the time. I'd just returned from Afghanistan. Kind of realized the political contract stuff wasn't for me anymore. It was getting a little bit too soft for me. There was no integrity in kind of what was going on with those contracts. So got out and joined the commercial aviation community. Ended up doing 4 years in Louisville, supervising maintenance for Republic Airlines, which flies for the big three, being America, Delta, and United. And then in 2018, I got a call from some guys out in California that had bought some Black Hawks off of the GSA and said, hey, we need somebody to build us a maintenance program. We heard you were the guys. So we struck a deal. I went out and built them 4 aircraft over the 5 years, built them a team and a good maintenance program that made them successful in the aerial wildland fire and utility construction community. And then what I had realized is that there was such a need for the skill set that I had, and there was so many people buying these aircraft off of the GSA that it would be best if I just created my own thing. So in 2022, I kind of started gathering up all the special tools I had and buying more special tools for this aircraft. And then, started servicing this thing across the globe. So basically, we have customers anywhere from Kansas, to Texas, and then anything west of Texas is where most of the business is, down into Australia. And then we're bringing on some customers from Chile right now, possibly Portugal, looking into some areas in Greece as well. But basically, they use these aircraft predominantly for aerial lift services. So I would say 70% of it's for aerial wildland fire. Maybe most of you guys have seen like the Palisades fire and all these big ones that you see on the news. But that's kind of what they're used for. So my skill set is, I can either acquire them for them, consult them, buy them and sell them to them, tear them down and build them for them, field maintenance, anything you can think of with this aircraft, we kind of cover A to Z. And we can do it with a single person or a team of men. So that's kind of the story about me and kind of where I end up with Prime Hawks, and what we do. And so that's kind of the whole tidbit there in the 3 or 4 minutes.
So what made you run for the Senate? What prompted this, getting into this race?
Well, honestly, in that 2018 era, that was kind of just pre-COVID. And as we all know, the government instituted a lot of illegal mandates against the American people. So in like that late 2019, 2020 era, with this job that I had helping this company in California build this maintenance program, you know, the mask mandate went into effect. Unfortunately, due to some childhood trauma, I can't wear a mask, especially for long periods of time. So I had decided that I would go and get a mask exemption. And so I found, after months of researching, a doctor in New Jersey. His name was Russell Sorosky, and he's a triple board certified neurologist. And we had a telehealth conference, and he said, "Yeah, absolutely. What you have is called generalized anxiety. It could lead to you fainting and all these things. So, we suggest that you don't wear the mask." And then he kind of went into further detail and said, "Hey, actually, I mean, with your facial hair, it doesn't matter whether you had any issues at all. I mean, there's no mask you can wear, that would protect you scientifically from anything, even the particulates that this mask is designed to protect you from." And so, just to kind of go into a little bit of the science behind that, the N95 mask, which was like basically their, king of all like predominant masks, right? Um, that mask gets its name from the idea that it's 95% effective in blocking particulates that are like zero point 0.3 microns or larger. Remember, well, COVID was like 0.01 microns. So basically, it's like putting up a chain link fence to stop mosquitoes, per se, right? So anyway, got this medical exemption, submitted that to the airlines. And then, of course, they had all these other illegal policies that went against the ACAA, which is the Air Carrier Access Act, and kind of made us do negative COVID tests and all these things. But it's okay anyway. I'll follow the illegal rules. I give them the mask exemption. I give them the negative COVID test, showing them I'm not a threat to them. And even when I do that, the airline basically comes back and says, "Well, hey, look, you don't qualify to fly without a mask, across the skies of the United States." It's like, okay, well, you're not my doctor, and whoever you're giving my information to is also not my doctor. I've given you my doctor's letter. I've given you a negative COVID test showing you that I'm not a threat to anyone here. And so they just basically said, look, based on what we have, you don't qualify, which was absolutely incorrect because, the CDC mandate had an exemption, to anyone with disabilities who couldn't wear a mask. And it basically was a pretty carte blanche, vague statement, which said, if a person has, a disability that aligns with the ADA or the Americans with Disabilities Act, if it's listed there, they're exempt from wearing the mask. But the problem is, they were all about controlling the populace. It was a show of obedience and who was going to, obey, the lords of our federal bureaucracy. That's all it was. It had nothing to do with science or safety. So yeah, that is one of the reasons why I'm running. Secondly, is the bloated government. all the money that we're seeing going to, Sesame Street in Pakistan and the Taliban, and all of these big funds of cash that you see going from our congressional government, to these places. They don't need to be doing this. So, things like that have, inspired me to run as well. So, and then not only that, there's a broken healthcare system in our state. Small businesses have been attacked, since COVID. And then, the numbers that they're supposed to basically push, to help the small businesses succeed, especially from the federal government standpoint, is a fallacy. I mean, for instance, I'll just tell you, the federal government is supposed to be giving something like 23% of federal contracts to small businesses. And in reality, it's only about 3%. I mean, that's the real deal of that, is that there's 20% of what they're saying is going to small businesses actually going to, the 1.5 to 2% large corporations, because America's made up of about 98% small businesses. Now, when you look at those numbers, I mean, that's something like $300 billion, which could really surplus our economy, across the nation, that we're missing out on. So, it's simple things like that. Like I always tell folks on the campaign trail, people look at me and say, well, you have no name notoriety, you have, no degrees, you have no money, no big donors or whatever. It's like, yeah, we're going to self-fund. I don't think it's going to be hard. I think if the people really want change and they want extreme, change in government, they'll listen to what we have in our agenda. And listen, the only degree that I do have that these fellas don't is a degree in common sense. So, I mean, it's silly to see what's going on up there. And, just like, kind of the old way of how our entire political structure was invented, just a guy is saying, hey, I've had enough. I'm tired of seeing what you guys are doing, not only with our taxpayer dollars, but just with the nation in general. So, I have no interest in starting, at a state level. I've had a lot of people say that, you don't have any name notoriety. You need to start at the state level, do something in Congress or the Senate there, and, work your way up. And it's like, look, my problem is not with the state. My problem is the federal government. Those are the ones that have attacked me. That's where I've done my research. That's what I'm sharp in. So, no, I'm going to run for the U.S. Senate. This is a perfect time, I think, in our political makeup to be running for a seat like this, especially coming out of a 40-year, Mitch McConnell, takeover. And the guy's been there since I was, born, actually, before I was born. So I think Kentucky wants change. I think they want a different voice. And so, as the old saying goes, here am I, send me, and I'm giving them an option.
Well, I've always told Jill, a candidate is legit when they're giving out their cell phone number. You know that they want
Correct.
to hear from you. You're the only person in the race who's done that. I was intrigued by your race. Some of the videos I saw, you were at a rally in Frankfurt, I believe.
Yes.
You were speaking there. So you have put yourself out there, and I definitely think you're going to get grassroots support, which is who votes in the primaries.
Correct.
So we just
Yeah.
got to get you through that primary.
And this is what I've told people at these meetings too. I go to a lot of the GOP meetings. So we've been to Hardin County, Hart County, um, several surrounding counties, because listen, I think that is where the people know the political makeup of their area the most. And we did the Lincoln dinner and all that, but listen, as much as some of those people are great people, that is an entertainment function. I mean, that is there to, get the celebratorious Rand Paul and the Thomas Massey in there, make everybody feel good about, what these guys are doing. I'm just going to be honest with you. I like both of those men, but neither one of them are upholding themselves to the constituent services of their seat. And listen, they have a constituent right now, not just me, but several other people, where they have the power because they're in a federal seat. And what I'm dealing with are federal three-letter agencies like the DOT, right? Like the DHS that placed me on a terrorist watch list 2 days after I sued the TSA, right? Um, they have the power to go and speak with these agencies. And now they have this coy administration, being Sean Guffey or Duffy, whatever his name is, who's in charge of the DOT, Christy Noem, Tulsi Gabbard, all these people. She's been placed on the Quiet Skies list too. Why has no one there reached out and said, "Hey, Mr. Ferris, we're going through a list of people that the Biden administration, targeted and tried to basically turn the government against, and you're on that list. And we know it's not right, and we want to make it right. So how can we do that?" But I reached out to Rand Paul, and when this thing was a hysteria in the 2022 era, and it was the big media spin and hype and all that, he was more than willing to write the DOT on my behalf. And guess what the DOT did? They responded and said, "Hey, we're working on it. Sit down, shut up, and color." And he goes, "Okay, hey, Mr. Ferris, they told me that they're working on it, so that's kind of it." Well, a year goes by, I hear nothing, even though he said that he's going to follow up and get back with me. So I hit him up again a couple more times. Well, now his answer is, "Well, hey, you have a lawsuit on this. There's nothing I can do for you." So so it's dead now because it's not, the cool thing to talk about anymore. When him and Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene and like 16 or 15 other, you know, representatives in Congress filed a mask mandate themselves in the same Western district that I did. And as a matter of fact, it started in Bowling Green. But I think because the judge was friends with Rand Paul that was selected for the case, he had to recuse himself. When that happens, that goes, by design to Louisville, which is the other, the Western District, and it went to Ben Beaton, the same judge I have. Now, they weren't arguing the mask mandate because there was someone there that was medically disabled. They were arguing the mask mandate was unlawful based on constitutional and state law violation. So, and the guy, the attorney, in Louisville, he walks around, claims to be a freedom fighting attorney about liberty and all this. I reached out to this guy several times and said, "Hey, I've got this case for you. I've got the evidence. I've got it all stacked up. Can you help?" And at every turn, every lawyer turned us down. So we had to do this pro se. And so listen, a lot of people say, "Well, it just sounds like you're pissed off." You're damn right I'm pissed off. Because listen, the entire establishment went against me. And I tried at every turn to grab the right resources and tell people, "Hey, here's an opportunity for you to take credit for this." But they didn't want it. They were too scared of it. They were afraid it was going to cost too much money. And I'm just going to be honest with you. We've just passed a motion to dismiss phase in the Western District as pro se litigants. And I don't think people understand how big of a deal that is. I mean, to pass a motion to dismiss phase on you know, basically federal and state law charges without counsel in today's, judicial structure is a pretty tough go. And I mean, there's over 180 dockets in this CDC lawsuit, which is titled Ferris versus CDC. And it's sitting right now on a motion for judgment on the pleadings, but, we'll see how that goes. This thing takes so long. I mean, I think the last filing in that case was 2 months ago. So, which is another problem. Our judiciary should not be taking this long to decide whether someone broke the law. I mean, it's very plainly written. It says you shall not do these things that you've done, but they give you so much, jargon, lawyer jargon in the language, and they build these cases, and then, they grab all this case law, which to me is also silly. I mean, it's like, look, you can go and quote all the case law you want. The law plainly says you shall not do this thing. And they just want to try to spin it on you and make it look like, well, your issue is special because, it doesn't really mean we broke the law in regard to what you were doing. No, you broke the law. You broke the law. And so let's just get over it and get it done with. But they're just so scared of accountability. It's just unreal. But yeah, I tell people all the time, there's a reason my phone number is on that website. That's by design, because when people want to hear from my campaign, I want them to speak to the guy who has the mind to have that conversation. I don't want them calling a campaign advisor. I don't want them calling somebody who has no idea what I'm going to say. And as a matter of fact, we tried the campaign advisor thing, and at every step of the way, what do? Oh, you need to do this. You need to do that. You got to change this on your social media. It's like, listen, hey, first of all, you're trying to change my identity. I'm not a politician. You're trying to run a politician's campaign. I'm not a politician. I'm not going to change my identity. I'm coming as Michael Faris from Elizabethtown, Kentucky, just a regular fella that blends in with the people, who's tired of what's going on with this bloated federal government, and he wants change, and he wants his people to help him out. So, no, I'm not going to stand around here and used car salesman these people. What you see is what you get. I will fund this thing myself. We're not encouraging donations, but we've raised several $1,000s just, I think, from the goodness of people's hearts, because they think that we need the money. But we'll buy the hats and the stickers and the yard signs, and we'll put up the advertisements. I don't think it costs that much money. I think honestly, if you were to look at it, I think you can get away with $45,000 to $50,000 by the time the race is over, and actually win, as long as you can get the grassroots movement to vote in the primary. At that point, people are going to throw themselves at you, but there's no reason we should be spending 5, 10, $12 million in a state, U.S. Senate primary. It's just absolutely absurd. It's 100% consumerism, which is just a waste of money. And, just like the yard signs, I don't even like them because what's going to happen with them when you're done? They're going to get thrown in the trash, put somebody's, garage behind a shelf somewhere and never to be seen again unless you run for another term. So I don't know. I just don't believe in the whole consumerism of the political, campaign structure, but we'll play the game to the extent that we need to get the visibility. But beyond that, like I said, what you see is what you get. And that's kind of how we're going to try to run this thing.
So I did have one of the constituents up here ask, were you able to speak at the Lincoln dinner?
Yes. So the Hardin County Lincoln Dinner did let me speak. And I was there for probably 3 or 4 minutes and listen, the vibe in the room, it was very kind of ill because there was a lot of what appeared to be rhinos there, especially, they kind of get close to some of these big name politicians. Um, and so listen, my story is not, rainbows and butterflies. It is accountability. And so not only that, when I speak, my voice carries a certain tone and it kind of sounds like, I'm kind of harping at these people, but I'm not, and I just plainly stand up and let these people know, look, because, whoever went before me, I think Rand Paul or Daniel Cameron probably. And I just got up there and said, look, as much as these guys sound, exciting and ecstatic and jubilant about what's going on in the government sphere, I'm here to tell you a different story, because guess what? They are politicians. They're not dealing with your problems. And as a matter of fact, your problems are not theirs. And you have to make your problems theirs because they go back to a little horse ranch farmhouse in Lexington or whatever, right? And they have their cups of teas and it's all beautiful and everything's nice. They're not struggling with what we're struggling with. And, they're also not having to balance a budget, and squeeze out week by week or month by month how they're going to, survive. So they just don't understand what it's like to be a true American. And none of these people, by all means, have created anything for anybody. They went to school, got brainwashed, and became politicians. I mean, what have they created for anybody? They've never signed anybody's paycheck. They've never uplifted anybody that I can tell. It's just all been, political garbage. And so they get in that little spin and they stay in there for years and years and years, which is why, just recently I signed a pledge on U.S. term limits. And I think that's important. I think we should be cutting them out, after a couple of terms and saying, hey, we need fresh ideas. We need to get you out of that because listen, it's no different than what Fort Knox does. They hire you for a couple of years. When you start to figure out the system, they throw you out the door because they don't want you figuring out what's going on in there, which is, by design is pretty smart. They don't want you being in there for 5, 10 years and finally figuring out how to go and heist the place, right? It makes total sense. That's what your politicians are doing. They're going in there and by year, 12, 13, 14, they figured out how to heist the American people's money through, you know, language that makes you feel safe and comfortable and progressive and it's all garbage. So yeah, 10, 12 years, get out, go back home, tend to your farm, go make something, go give somebody a job, go get a job, whatever the case may be. That's the way the system was designed anyway.
So one of the other questions, because we're not going to let anybody forget what happened during COVID, and I know you talked about the lawsuits with the masks. What else were you doing during the COVID, the nightmare that we had to go through? Because I do believe that was just a test, and that's something they're going to keep attempting to do something else to steal our liberties. So we did have constituents asking us; they wanted to know from you, like, what all were you doing during the COVID time?
They called us quote unquote essential workers, right? Because during COVID, there was some of the largest wildland fires that took place there in California. And I think one of those years, it was a record breaking million acre burn year, which was, kind of one of the biggest fires California had ever seen um, in, I guess, traceable history. So most of COVID, I was out in a field manning a helicopter maintaining water buckets, an aircraft, not only for the company that I was employed but by customers, that are now essentially my company's customers of Prime Hawks, other customers' aircraft. So, I was working probably, a month and a half to 2 months to a week or 2 weeks off and going back out and doing it again because obviously this is a very niche industry. There's a limited amount of resources for qualified hands. And so the scare within itself, some of these guys, they feel a little sick and they would call and say, oh, I might have COVID, I shouldn't fly or I shouldn't whatever. So what does that do? That puts the pressure on somebody who's like, all right, well, I'll take the work, or, and I'll go do it. So a lot of these folks that kind of took the fear mongering bait, I say, and I don't think they're bad people. I think what they were just, they were told something and they trusted their government and their, quote unquote, elected officials and the experts, right, as they like to self-proclaim. And so it scared them. And they said, I don't want to get sick. I don't want to die. I don't want to bring back home to my family. Well, me, I'm a different guy. It's like, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die. That's God's will. That's kind of how I live my life. But so, yeah, I'm going to go to work. So during COVID, most of what I was doing was working. And then when I did have time off, obviously it was battling, the TSA and the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and then the CDC and the Western District of Kentucky. There wasn't much else that I needed to deal with during COVID because here's the deal with the vaccines. When they first started that, they had brought out this, idea they were going to mandate vaccines for federal government contractors. And unfortunately, even though I'm working as a complete civilian, these companies are getting, federal contracts to put fire out with the U.S. Forest Service, which is an arm of the Department of Interior. So, they initially came out and said, hey, everybody's gonna have to be vaccinated, even if you're a federal contractor. And that's where I drew the line. And I simply just went in and talked to the company man. And I said, look, and this is probably, you're talking 22, 3-ish. So this company's 3 years old. We barely just about to make this maintenance program a well-oiled machine. So I still have a little bit of sway in kind of what's happening in that entire company's makeup because it's such a small company. And I sat down with those company men and I said, look, all of these men out here that maintain your aircraft, they are on the same boat as me. And so, we need to discuss this vaccine issue. It sounds like the Forest Service is going to try to tell you that if you want a contract, that we're all going to have to be vaccinated. And I said, I'm telling you right now, I've already discussed with these men. I'm the leader of this team. And we've all banded together and said, hey, we're not going to do it. We don't trust it. We don't like it. We think it needs more time to work itself out as far as what it's going to do to somebody. And they just simply have not researched it. So I said, listen, if you have to have these federal contracts and you need somebody else here to man those contracts who are vaccinated, we will give you the time to find those employees. But if it's a situation where it's do or die, we're gone. And that's 6 of us. Your whole company's gone. You have to find 6 maintainers. I did donate to folks who were, kind of pro se, doing their own thing, even people with attorneys. Josh Yoder with U.S. Freedom Flyers. I don't know if you're familiar with that guy. He was kind of a big advocate for the airline pilots, not only with the vaccines, but a little bit about the masking. And then there's still a guy today, Captain Bahig Saliba. He is an old prior American Airlines pilot, fired for refusing the COVID vaccine. And there are still many of these stories, right? And so I have a network of people that fortunately, as a U.S. Senator, I can help beyond the borders of the state of Kentucky. And I know these people well. We all sat through countless hours of research, meetings, strategy. There was a coalition of us, I think 26 people that filed lawsuits across the land. So these are the people I want to help. I want to help those people who are standing up, not just the people within my state, but beyond, because those people were fighting for your rights too, and they deserve a little bit of redress. So basically the idea behind getting rid of judges is, as a guy who's been fighting in the judicial system, and kind of watching what judges do, we have to return, in my opinion, district and court of appeals judge nominations back to the people by way of a ballot. In 1789, they had what they call the Judiciary Act, which is what created the Court of Appeals and the district courts and the judges, which were appointed by George Washington. Now, it appears to me that was kind of constructed that way as a way to keep political pressure off of the judiciary. No donations, no big, kind of rallies for, voting for judges and this and that, and no left wing or right wing, Democrat or Republican. The problem is in Congress, all of those people that are going to vote in the Senate to confirm or deny these picks that the president appoints have already been through that process anyway. So they're bought and paid for. So you're still getting a vote from the same political pressure. It does not matter whether the judge himself went through that political campaign, or if the guy who's voting to confirm or deny his appointment went through that campaign. It is the same. They were donated by the same PACs and the same supermajorities and the same whatever you name it's where they get their cash. And then they go in this back room and make these deals and say, okay, well, we're going to confirm this guy, but we're going to give him hell about this because it's the theater behind it, and the people are going to think we're going to fight for him. Listen, these people are not smart. We're just as smart as they are, and they'll have you think that they've got some, grand brain that's bigger than yours, but it's just not the case. Because I'm going to tell you, when you sit and talk to these people, and I'm talking judges alike, when you bring a certain law to some of these guys in these hearings, I have heard more judges look at me and say, well, sir, what does that mean? What do you mean? What does that mean? You're the judge. You tell me what it means. I've got the law here that says that's not the way. And you're trying to tell me that their argument, bears to stand a chance. Well, I'm just trying to understand it. Maybe you should have read the law before we had this hearing. How does that sound? That is what's going on, and that's a problem. And so I would say, I would bear to argue that they only know about 30% of anything they opine on. Everything else is a new case. Everything else is a new law. And listen, that's because there's too many laws, that have, basically veered away from the Constitution. Another guy the other day brought up a fact that, Article 6, Section 2 and 3 talks about, federal versus state law. And if there shall ever be, a federal or state law that goes against the Constitution wins every time. That is simply not what's happening. They're making state laws against the Constitution. For instance, your Second Amendment, it says shall not be infringed. And there are states that have laws against guns that say they can't own them for certain whatever reasons. Any gun law in this whole country should say reference Amendment 2 of the U.S. Constitution. I mean, they wrote it that way for a reason. You cannot make state laws that trump what the Constitution says. If you don't like what the Constitution says, you either get a majority of the states to agree to amend it, or do you do it in Congress with 66% of the vote in both the House and the Senate, right? So that has to be done through delegation. If you don't like what it says, change it. And so for me, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, which deals with that appointments clause, the only explicit language there is that basically the president's job is to appoint Supreme Court justices, which at the time there were 6. Now there are 9. How many are we going to get the next Democrat president, right? The more they put in there, the more they're going to get the people they want, because they're just going to keep no different than adding illegal aliens to the country, where they swell the numbers so they can get more delegates in Congress and that vote like them. So you got, just like the census they use to put these illegals on there, you got to get them illegals off, get a true number of the American citizens and the citizenry which you represent. Now, here's our representatives in Congress, right? Because what is it, 535 members of Congress, which I think is, quite honestly, might be maxed out at the time. But if you shaved off the illegal immigrants from New York and California, how many constituent representatives would they have there that are voting liberal and socialist agendas, right? So the judges clause, that for me, just to kind of go back to that, we have to get the power of those votes and impeachments of those judges, because that is the final say in this land. I don't care what anyone says. You can go and break a law, make a law, change a law, whatever. At the end of the day, the enforcement body lies in the judiciary, because anything that anyone does illegal to you, unless you blatantly take a gun, walk up to a man and blow his head off on camera and videotape it, the cops are not coming to save you. The sheriff's department and the FBI are not coming to save you. The airlines broke the law in relation to me. My only way to get redress and hold these people accountable for what they've done is to sit down with them in a court of law. If that judge is corrupt, I am screwed. Just like anybody else who brings any other law violation before a court in this land. And so you have to change the mindset of the judges. So those judges, especially district and court of appeals, and here's why I say that, and here's why I don't say Supreme Court, because listen, DC is not a state currently. DC is part of Washington, which is a federal bureaucratic mashup of, infrastructure. The Supreme Court is there. So it belongs to no state, right? So there's no sovereignty in that. I understand that we need to allow the president to pick Supreme Court justices because that's the way the Constitution was written. Now, this Court of Appeals and this district court judgeship and all this, that was all created in 1789 out of thin air once they realized, oh, we're getting swamped with all these, cases about people wanting redress post-Revolutionary War. Because guess what was happening? And I'll equate it to this. The King of England was sending in his own governors, his own peace officers, his own judges into this land of the 13 colonies and was saying, this is your ruler in your 13 colonies that you say are among a free land. That is what's happening now. You have one guy sitting in an office in Washington, D.C., deciding what judges and what. And it makes sense. That's what they came from. But the thing is, they're sitting in a period of time where they know they're surrounded by men and women who are all like-minded. They're all saying, listen, we want absolute, separation from tyranny. So when George Washington selects a judge, they're like, oh, here, he's got our interest in mind. Absolutely. Let him pick the judge. He knows better than we do. That judge is always going to opine in regard to our benefit because he is thinking the same way we are, and he's read the Constitution in the plain text of the way it was written. That is not what's going on today. So the only way to get rid of these judges now is by way of a congressional vote. And I'm telling you, there is not an ounce of promise in this land that Congress is going to remove any district or court of appeals judge because a long history, it's just not happened because they live under this, what they call good behavior clause. As long as that judge is a good boy, he's going to be there forever, probably a lifetime appointment until he dies on the bench, right? So I think that's also a problem. I think we probably need to have some fresh ideas in law too, because no different than Fort Knox, where you get in there, you learn the system and how to heist it. And not only that, after you've opined so many cases, how passionate can one man be about continuing to opine on law? At some point you're like, yeah, I'm burnt out. Like I'm done with this, So I think that there should be a little bit of term limits on those judges as well. And what is the second one there? I think it says, basically holding big corporations accountable to their COVID era mandates.
Yep.
And so, for me, that's especially the airlines, but it's anybody that went along with it. And I'll go ahead and bring up my opponent, Nate Morris. I think he needs to be held accountable too, because he was a huge Lexington businessman who had the power of a voice to come out and say, hey, we're not doing DEI. We're not doing BLM. We're not masking. We're not forced vaccinating. We're not LGBTQ in this whole thing, right? This is nonsense. If you want to do your own thing, that is fine. You are a free people and you absolutely have the power to do that. But as far as the way that I run this company, it is a company of free people, free thinking people, and we need everyone to be on board that the success of our company revolves around our individual liberties, right? He didn't. As a matter of fact, he signed letters advocating that, his trash employees got the vaccine next in line to healthcare workers. And he's wearing, who knows, it looks like a $20 mask on his face, like basically marketing some masks for some company. Then, separating his employees based on what they align with. Oh, we need to support BLM and the people who are rioting and all this. No, they burned our cities down. I mean, come on, get a grip, guy. You got $1 billion company. You're from the state of Kentucky. You got a senator like Mitch McConnell and who's been up there for 40 years and Rand Paul here. You've got someone who you can go speak to and get the support of your government. And listen, Don't tell us you're a political outsider when at 21 years old, you're already up there receiving awards from these people. You are not a political outsider. So that for me is the accountability phase, not just the airlines. It is every company that stood up and spit in your face. And when you walked in, said, you got to put a mask on. No, actually, I don't. Because listen, it's an EUC device. And as a matter of fact, none of it about it has been approved by any scientific studies. And just like, the airlines broke the laws in trying to force you to wear that blue surgical mask. Um, and we even argued in court that these people were practicing medicine without a license. They're telling me I must wear the surgical mask. They have no idea what the harms are and haven't even offered me a chance to refuse or accept those harms. That is law. Law says that if they're going to give you something EUC, you must be given the opportunity to refuse or accept it. And you must also be aware of its harms and side effects. No one did that. And so for me, what that looks like is the ACAA. If we change that language, especially with the airlines, if we change the ACA, we make it reciprocal and say, hey, these people do have a private right of action to sue you, and you did break the law, right? And Congress never intended for you to be able to escape accountability because you own some airlines, right? That is not what Congress intended. And if they did, they should all be fired, right? I mean, that's the idea behind it. So, yeah, second point being basically holding these people accountable. And I don't know what every single company how it looks like we hold those people accountable piece by piece, but that's going to take a little research. And of course, I need some feedback from voters, and constituents who are going to be in that fight. And I'll get that data. Right now, what I know is the airline part, and I can absolutely zero in on that. But I'm sure there are plenty of people that I can speak with that I can get data from, and we can, piece by piece start picking these companies and saying, hey, guess what you did, and guess what? The accountability is coming. Now, I was raised on a farm. I know what my dad did, but most of what we did was, with the almanac. We didn't get involved in government funding. We didn't take subsidies. We didn't need none of that. We were self-sufficient. So I say that because I believe in the farmland of Kentucky, and I believe that we house a lot of good soil here that probably, feeds the nation, right? So we have to take care of that land. There's a lot of good resources here in the state, from farms to manufacturing, and I think even natural gas, if I had to go down that rabbit hole. So that's what we need to be tapping into, is all of those resources, and then feeding the land to make sure that it stays healthy to reuse that year after year. The problem is, I think just a couple of years ago, they talked like something about 54% of our able-bodied working people were on welfare. So we got to cut that out first, right? So that's where you got to really start, is you have to put these people on welfare back to work. Now, they've just built this big conglomerate in Glendale, which was supposed to be a big battery plant, but it took them so long to build it. It appears the technology has surpassed its ability to sustain its, own job market. So what happened? They bid it out to Nissan. They bid it out to all these car manufacturers. And listen, I know a little bit about the history of that land in Hardin County. That farm family kept that land for many years, from Honda, Toyota, Chevrolet. Yeah, they kept that land for so many years. But what happened is, those people are gone now. The children have it, and we've gotten lazy. We don't want to do farming no more. We don't want to. You see where I'm going with this? So we're losing tradition. We're losing farmland. We're losing the ability to feed our people, under the guise of bringing in new jobs. Now, I'm all for manufacturing. I think we should definitely be a manufacturing capital of the world, because there are people here that have great skills and love to do that type of work. Problem is, we got to go find them. We got to get them off the drugs that they've allowed to come across the border, right? Because right now they're sucked into a hole of, whether it be fentanyl or methamphetamine or you name it. We got to go get those people back in the workforce. And some of those people are on welfare. So what do? You incentivize them and you say, look, we're going to spend the money anyway. We'll keep you on the program. You got 12 months. Go find a job. And as a matter of fact, here's 100 new ones. Go do that job, right? And get them off of this thing that they're doing. And without going too far into it, we had an opportunity to eradicate basically drug addiction here in the state with a guy named Brian Hubbard through Ibogaine. And unfortunately, our current attorney general kicked him out of the state, and he's doing it in Texas now. If you don't know anything about that guy, I suggest you look him up. Brian Hubbard, Ibogaine. It actually happened when Daniel Cameron was AG. And I think Daniel Cameron actually did the right thing in trying to get him the funding he needed. Unfortunately, Daniel ran for governor. He failed that test and basically got kicked out of politics. And I think the way that the whole thing with Breonna Taylor worked out, I think he probably stays out of politics for a long time until that is erased from memory, just because of what his job was during that whole BLM Breonna Taylor rioting situation. Anyway, so we got to get manufacturing. We got to have it. We got to have our natural gas. We got to tap into that. We got to protect our farmland, and we got to get our farmers, the resources they need. Whether that be, uh, let's call it fertilize. Maybe that's a little expensive. Bring that cost down somehow, because if that fertilizer comes from somewhere else, there's probably a tariff on it right now. It's costing us a lot of money to buy all of those things. And I'll be honest with you, most farmers, they don't get paychecks every month. What they do is they dump all their money through the year into this one large resource in hopes that when the crop harvests, that they're going to get all that money back and then some, right? So farmers are usually always living on last year's wages, right? And just trying to make it work. At least that's the way my dad did it. And from what I understood, me and him didn't talk finances a lot, but I watched him year after year, pull out a banker's box of all the receipts, and he did his own taxes. And he can't even do that no more because the tax codes are so crazy, right? That he can't get out everything he's done all year and say, yep, I've done all this. There's so many codes and laws and avenues and loopholes. And now you need a CPA who has another CPA who has a degree in CPA LMNOP. It's so silly, right? So we need to get away from that as well. But yeah, we need to give farmers the resources. What that looks like, I think, honestly, I've got a couple of folks I graduated with that own some pretty semi-large farms. I'd like to tap into some of their knowledge of what they're seeing today. I haven't farmed in over, I'm 38, I was 18. I probably haven't farmed in 20 years. So, and I only did it for 6 years of my life as an adolescent, where I really didn't know a whole lot other than how the tractor worked, how to fix the tractor, what the seed looked like, where the seed should go, how long it should take it to grow, what we need to put on it to get it to grow, what pesticide or herbicide, fertilizer, whatever it needs to be put on, how to cut the tobacco, how to hang the tobacco, how to strip it, how to bale it, the whole thing. So although I was learning about farmland, and I have a great appreciation for what that industry does for our nation, whether it be corn, soybean, tobacco, hay, whatever, we got to have those things, obviously, and we have to make sure they have the resources they need. And look, just because I don't know exactly what they need at the moment, that's ever changing. I mean, we've had a lot of rain this year. Some of these crops may not be doing well just because they're drowned, or farmers can't get in the field to, go and mess with those crops because there's not a machine that will be able to go on the dirt. It won't withstand it. But it's a sidebar. A lot of people say that's due to weather modification. I don't know much about that either, but I'm open to the conversation. So I have no idea. I mean, I know there've been a lot of rain before when I was a youngster. Does seem to be a lot now. Are they trying to wash us out? I don't know. But definitely farmers need resources. But we also have to keep in mind, we don't need to be looking for a handout either. As a people, we need to be able to make sure that those farmers have their resources, based on how we treat that industry. It doesn't need to be that the farmer goes to the federal government and says, hey, can you pay for my fertilizer? Because it all needs to be self-sustainment, right? It needs to be personal responsibility, personal accountability. And look, if you're a farmer, you know how that works. And if you need help, you are in trouble because you know how all this grows. You've been doing it for years. It's been passed down generation to generation. So yes, absolutely. We want to make sure the farmers have the resources they need. But another bullet point on that same page that you're on now being the parental choice, basically their right to choose where their children are educated. I am of the opinion that, obviously you've seen a lot about the Department of Education being abolished. I don't think it's actually went through yet. They've had some votes or they talked about it, whatever. But I'm of the opinion that, look, if you don't want to take your child to a schoolhouse, you should absolutely be able to, do that and raise them in your own home, whether that's with a neighbor and 6 other neighboring kids. As long as they, learn the minimum as far as basic curriculum, reading, a little bit about science, a lot about history, I think, especially about America, and the right history, not this watered down version you get in school. Because listen, I didn't know a lot of this stuff until I became a grown man that I had to research on my own. We need more people who are going to stand up with a spine and say, listen, I don't care about your money. I don't care what you think I should think about your money. I don't care if you think I need the money. That's not why I'm running. And listen, you would be amazed at how many people look at me dead in the eye, people like me, and they say, "You're not going to win. There's
you
no
are.
way you're going to win."
Yes, you are.
Because you don't have notoriety, you have no name recognition, you don't have a war chest. And I said, "Hey, listen, that is not my problem, sir or ma'am. That is actually your problem because you're not doing anything about it." And I don't want to be I don't want to make you sound like you're not doing your job. But at the end of the day, if you're going to come to a guy like me who's trying to give you what you're asking for and you're rejecting it, then you either A, want to change the system, or B, you just want to complain. Which one is it? So pick a side. And that's kind of what I tell people. And listen, I don't have a beautiful mouth sometimes. I sometimes I go off and I get a little passionate. And that's just that's what we do as Americans. That's part of it. Listen, I am faithful. I want you guys to understand that. I do believe in God. I was raised Southern Baptist. I was saved by the grace of God.